It was an ordinary early morning in the quiet suburban neighborhood, where the sun had just begun to rise, casting a soft golden hue over the rows of neatly manicured lawns and well-maintained homes. The parking lot, usually tranquil at this hour, was now the setting of an unexpected confrontation. A few parked cars sat still, bathed in the gentle warmth of the morning light. But in the midst of the serenity, a single scene would soon unfold that would alter the lives of everyone who witnessed it. Mrs. Clarice Brooks had been in this neighborhood for decades, a staple of kindness and compassion. A black woman in her 60s, she was known for her quiet grace and the warmth she extended to everyone around her. As a grandmother, she had always been a guiding figure to the children in the community. Whether it was helping with homework, offering a comforting word, or bringing a homemade pie to a neighbor in need, she was more than just a resident. She was a cornerstone of the community, a symbol of love and respect. Her life had been built on acts of kindness, and her name was always spoken with admiration. This morning, however, things were different. As Mrs. Clarice made her way to her old car in the lot, she was unaware of the dark cloud that was about to cast a shadow over her peaceful morning. Deputy Mark Henderson, a white police deputy known in the community for his controversial views and racial biases, had been patrolling the area. With a quick glance, he spotted Mrs. Clarice's aging vehicle parked in an area where, according to him, it seemed out of place. Without cause or any real suspicion, he pulled his car over and stepped out, his gaze already suspicious, as though her very presence was an offense. "Ma'am," he called out with an air of authority, his voice gruff. "What are you doing here so early? This parking lot is for residents only, and you don't look like you belong." Eleanor, caught off guard but unfazed, kept her composure. With a calm yet dignified response, she met his gaze without flinching. "I am just here to take care of some things, Deputy. Is there a problem?" But Henderson, his mind already clouded with prejudice, was not listening. His tone grew harsher, more aggressive. This was not a routine stop. It was an opportunity for him to assert his dominance, to humiliate someone who didn't meet his standards, who, in his narrow view, was out of place. The quiet morning had suddenly turned into a scene of tension and discomfort, where the weight of racial prejudice was being thrust into the open, with Eleanor standing firm, resolute in her dignity. Eleanor Brooks was much more than just a kind and respected figure in her neighborhood. She was a guiding force, a second mother to many. As a grandmother, she exuded warmth and care, always ready to lend a helping hand or a comforting word. It wasn't unusual for her to be found bringing homemade casseroles to new neighbors or volunteering to babysit the children in the community. She was known for her ability to connect with everyone, regardless of their background or walk of life. To the children, she was a mentor who encouraged them to pursue their dreams, and to the adults, she was a reliable source of wisdom and support. Her small home, adorned with family photos and books on a variety of subjects, was a symbol of both her history and her deep commitment to her community. People turned to her not just for help, but for her unwavering moral compass. Mrs. Clarice embodied the essence of kindness, someone who had spent a lifetime working to create a safe and caring environment for those around her. But behind the kindness and the strength that defined her later years was a past filled with trials and tribulations. Mrs. Clarice had been a civil rights activist during the tumultuous 1960s, a time when racial inequality and injustice were rampant. In her youth, she had marched side by side with others, demanding justice and equality. She was there during the protests, during the sit-ins, and in the face of the police who tried to silence them. She had seen firsthand the brutality of racism, the cruel and dehumanizing treatment of her people. But through it all, she stood firm, believing that her fight for equality was just, and that one day things would change. The struggles of her past were not something Eleanor spoke of often, but they were always present in her resilience. Despite the injustices she had faced, be it the humiliation, the threats, or the deep wounds left by years of racial inequality, she had never let bitterness consume her. Instead, she had turned those painful experiences into fuel for her ongoing fight for justice, equality, and fairness. In her heart, she carried the belief that, despite everything, change was possible, and that her work, both past and present, could contribute to that better future. Deputy Mark Henderson's breath was shallow as he stood over Mrs. Clarice Brooks, his eyes narrowing with suspicion. His hand hovered over his gun, but it wasn't drawn yet. His gaze shifted between her and the old worn-out car she had parked so innocently in the lot. There was something about her presence that didn't sit right with him. His mind raced with assumptions, ones he hadn't even bothered to question. A black woman, an older one at that, driving a dilapidated car. It was all too much of a stereotype in his mind, too easy to link to the threat he believed was lurking beneath the surface. His thoughts were colored by a long-standing belief that people like Mrs. Clarice didn't belong in such neighborhoods. They weren't supposed to have the same rights, the same privileges. And when he saw her car parked in the wrong place, it was just the perfect excuse. He was already set on his course before even stepping out of his patrol car. "Mom, what exactly are you doing here?" Henderson's voice was sharp, more than a simple question. It was a demand. He took a step forward, his hand tightening around his holster. "This parking lot is for residents, and you don't look like one." Mrs. Clarice, despite the indignity of the moment, didn't flinch. She didn't raise her voice or shift her posture. She simply looked at Henderson, her expression calm but firm. "I'm not causing any trouble, Deputy. I'm here for personal reasons, nothing more. Is there a problem?" Henderson's eyes hardened. His hand still hovered by his gun, but this time it was the weight of his assumptions that weighed on him. There was something deeply unsettling about how composed she was, how she didn't show any signs of fear. She should have been scared, but she wasn't. "Don't get smart with me, lady," he snapped, his voice rising. "I'm asking you a simple question. What's your business here?" Mrs. Clarice's voice remained steady. "I'm not getting smart, Deputy. I'm simply telling you the truth." The words hung in the air, but Henderson was already too far gone in his assumptions. He couldn't see her calm demeanor as anything other than defiance. To him, it felt like disrespect, like a challenge to his authority. The tension between them was palpable, and yet no one stepped in. A few residents had begun to gather around, watching the scene unfold in front of them. Among them was Sophie Mitchell, a young mother who lived just down the street. She had been watching from her window, and her heart had skipped when she saw the deputy stop Mrs. Clarice. Sophie didn't know the older woman very well, but she had seen her around, always helping, always kind. She couldn't help but feel a knot of unease in her stomach, but something kept her rooted in place. She had never been one to get involved in conflict, especially not with the police. There was something terrifying about the idea of confronting them. Her gaze flicked nervously to the others standing around, but no one was making a move. They all stood silent, either pretending not to notice or afraid to speak up. They didn't want to get involved in something that could escalate quickly. It was a strange, uncomfortable sort of inaction, but Sophie couldn't tear her eyes away from the unfolding scene. Henderson's voice broke the silence again, harsh and impatient. "I'm going to have to check your vehicle, ma'am. Something about this doesn't sit right with me." Mrs. Clarice's posture remained steady, though a subtle tightening in her jaw betrayed her growing frustration. "You have no reason to search my car, Deputy. I haven't done anything wrong." Henderson didn't listen. His mind was already made up. He moved forward with authority, his hand resting now on the side of her car, as he opened the door, ignoring her protests. "I don't need your permission to check. This is procedure." Eleanor remained calm, her dignity unwavering, as she watched him rummage through her car. Every item he touched, from the old grocery bag to the small purse resting on the passenger seat, felt like another indignity heaped upon her. His touch was rough, invasive. It wasn't just the search. It was the blatant disrespect, the assumption that she had something to hide. He opened her purse without asking, rifling through it with a sense of entitlement. "Nothing but old receipts and personal items," Henderson muttered, but his tone was tainted with the belief that there had to be something, anything, that would validate his actions. He wanted to see proof of his assumptions. As Henderson continued his search, Eleanor's mind raced back to the countless times she had stood her ground against injustice, each instance a test of her strength and resilience. She had endured far worse in her lifetime, and this moment, though deeply painful, would not break her. She would not allow this deputy to make her feel less than. She would not allow him to humiliate her. Behind them, Sophie's fingers trembled as she held her phone in her pocket, her breath catching in her throat. She had never expected to see something like this. The fear that had held her in place began to dissipate as she remembered the words Mrs. Clarice had spoken to her once. Silence is not neutrality. Silence is complicity with injustice. With newfound courage, Sophie quietly pulled out her phone, her hand steadying as she began to record, documenting the very moment that so many had failed to act. Mrs. Clarice's voice, calm and measured, could be heard beneath Henderson's rising anger, but the deputy was so caught up in his assumptions that he didn't even seem to notice. Meanwhile, Henderson, consumed with frustration, turned to her with a sneer. "You know you're making this worse for yourself," he said, his tone laced with venom. "Maybe if you didn't act like you have something to hide, I'd be more lenient." But Mrs. Clarice was not intimidated. She remained silent, her eyes locked on his, refusing to allow him to strip away her dignity. This was a battle, but it was one she had fought many times before. She knew the stakes, and as the search escalated, so too did the realization among the onlookers. Their silence, their unwillingness to intervene, had allowed this injustice to unfold unchecked. But it wouldn't last much longer. The power of one voice was beginning to shift the tide, even if only for a moment. As Deputy Henderson continued his intrusive search of Eleanor's car, the air around them seemed to thicken with tension. Henderson's voice, harsh and dismissive, echoed in the otherwise quiet morning, but Eleanor's responses were measured, unwavering. She was, as always, the picture of grace under pressure, but in the eyes of those watching she was more than just a dignified older woman. She was a symbol of the fight for justice, even when that fight was fought quietly. Sophie Mitchell's eyes never left the scene. Her breath quickened as she watched Henderson continue to invade Eleanor's space. The deputy's every action seemed to strip away not just the older woman's dignity, but the very essence of fairness itself. And in that moment Sophie's mind echoed with the words Mrs. Clarice had once shared with her. "Silence is not neutrality. Silence is complicity with injustice." The words rang like a bell in Sophie's mind. She could no longer stand by, watching injustice unfold right in front of her eyes, without doing something. Fear had always kept her back in the past, but this time it was different. Something inside her stirred, and a sense of moral clarity cut through her hesitation. With trembling hands, Sophie slid her phone from her pocket. She held it low, trying not to draw attention as she discreetly began recording. The lens of the phone captured the scene, preserving every moment. Henderson's haughty movements, his sneers, and Mrs. Clarice's unwavering composure. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she focused on the task at hand. The phone shook slightly, but she kept it steady. She was doing what needed to be done. Mrs. Clarice's words had inspired Sophie to find the courage to speak for her, even if it was through the lens of her phone. She was no longer silent. She would not allow Henderson's racism to be swept under the rug. The recording was not just a document of a single event. It was a weapon, a way to hold this deputy accountable for his actions. Sophie could feel the weight of it as she captured every second, knowing that this evidence might change everything. But as she captured every second, knowing that this evidence might change everything. But as she continued to film, Sophie wasn't the only one noticing what was happening. The crowd that had gathered around, watching in silence, was starting to stir. James Caldwell, a middle-aged man who had lived in the neighborhood for years, stepped forward first. He had been watching the scene unfold with growing discomfort, but it wasn't until he saw Sophie with her phone that he realized something needed to be done. James had lived in this neighborhood long enough to know how things worked, how the police often held power without accountability, how communities turned their heads when something unjust happened. He had been complicit in his silence for far too long, but this time he could no longer stand idly by. He wasn't an activist, but the injustice was clear, and his conscience wouldn't let him stay quiet. "Deputy!" James's voice rang out, cutting through the tension. His words were not confrontational, but they carried a firm resolve. "What are you doing? You don't have the right to treat her like this." Henderson's head snapped around, startled by the challenge to his authority. His eyes narrowed, a flash of irritation crossing his face. "Mind your business, sir," he growled, his voice laced with venom. "This is an official matter. Stay out of it." But James didn't back down. "I don't care what kind of official business it is. You have no right to treat her this way. She hasn't done anything wrong." The words hung in the air like a challenge, and for a moment Henderson stood frozen, caught off guard by the direct confrontation. It wasn't just James speaking anymore. It was the collective unease of the crowd finally finding its voice. A few more figures in the crowd, emboldened by James's words, stepped forward. Laura Bennett, a pharmacist from the nearby drugstore, was one of the first to speak up. She had always admired Mrs. Clarice from afar, her wisdom, her grace, her tireless commitment to her community. Laura knew that this was wrong. She couldn't stay quiet any longer. "Deputy Henderson, stop right there," Laura said, her voice firm but calm. "This is wrong and you know it. She's done nothing to deserve this treatment. Let her go." Henderson's face reddened with frustration. He wasn't used to people standing up to him. He was the one who controlled the situation, who held power in these moments. But now people were questioning that power. People were breaking the silence that had allowed deputies, like him, to act without consequences. Laura's intervention sparked something in others as well. People who had been watching quietly now began to murmur in agreement. A young man named Daniel Reyes, who worked at the local cafe, spoke up. "He's right. She doesn't deserve this. She's a good person. You have no right to treat her like a criminal." As the word spread, more voices joined in. It wasn't a loud chorus, but the quiet resistance was enough. The community which had once stood silent was beginning to find its voice. People from all walks of life, neighbors, friends, even strangers, were standing up to the injustice before them. The atmosphere was shifting. The more people spoke out, the more Henderson's power seemed to wane. The crowd was no longer passive. It was active, pushing back against the status quo, challenging the injustice they were witnessing. The silence that had once allowed Henderson's behavior to continue was now being broken piece by piece. And then from the back of the crowd, Sophie stepped forward, her phone still held firmly in her hand. She had recorded everything: the humiliation, the aggression, the disregard for Mrs. Clarice's rights. Her voice was calm, but unwavering, as she addressed the deputy. "I've been recording this whole incident," she said, her eyes locking with Henderson's. "You can't get away with this." Henderson's expression flickered, the realization that his actions had been documented. The very thing he thought he could get away with seemed to shake him. The sense of control he had clung to was slipping away, and for the first time he was confronted with the consequences of his actions. The crowd's awakening was complete. Eleanor had inspired Sophie's courage, and now that courage was spreading, igniting the fire of resistance in others. The community which had once stood silently by was now united in its demand for justice. And as the deputy faltered, he realized that the tide was turning, and this time he couldn't stop it. The rising tension in the air was palpable as the crowd grew bolder, voicing their disapproval of Deputy Henderson's actions. In the midst of this rising storm, the sound of another car pulling up caught everyone's attention. A sleek black sedan came to a halt, and the door opened with a quiet click. From the vehicle emerged Michael Donovan, the city's chief administrative deputy, a man of authority respected by many, and known for his level-headed approach to the challenges facing their community. His eyes scanned the scene before him, taking in the group of onlookers, the distressed deputy, and the unshaken woman standing resolutely before him. As soon as Michael stepped forward, a hush fell over the crowd. They all knew him, and in that moment his presence commanded attention. He walked toward Deputy Henderson, his gaze steady, before turning toward Eleanor. "Deputy Henderson," Michael's voice rang out, calm but authoritative, "I believe you have made a grave mistake." The words carried the weight of someone who had seen much and was unwilling to tolerate injustice, no matter who it came from. Henderson stiffened at the sound of Michael's voice. He knew that the chief administrative deputy didn't arrive unless something serious was afoot. His heart began to race, and his posture shifted from arrogance to unease. He turned to Michael, trying to explain, "Sir, I'm just doing my job." "This woman," Michael held up a hand, cutting him off. "Eleanor Brooks is not just any woman," Deputy Henderson. She is the newly appointed judge for this district, a woman of high standing, integrity, and great respect in this community. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Eleanor, a judge? It took a moment for the word. The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Mrs. Clarice, a judge? It took a moment for the words to sink in. But when they did, it was as if a veil had been lifted from the eyes of the gathered crowd. The woman who had been treated with such disdain was not only a pillar of the community, but now a figure of legal authority herself. The sheer audacity of Henderson's actions became all the more glaring. Henderson's face drained of color, and his hand shook slightly as he tried to regain his composure. I didn't know, he stammered, now visibly shaken. He took a hesitant step forward, his eyes darting between Michael and Eleanor. I'm sorry, ma'am. I didn't realize who you were. I shouldn't have, I apologize. But Eleanor's voice, calm and unwavering, cut through the apology like a knife. Your apology means nothing, Deputy Henderson, she said, her eyes locking with his, unblinking. You didn't treat me with disrespect because you didn't know who I was. You treated me this way because of the color of my skin, because of your prejudices. You didn't see a judge standing before you. You saw a black woman, and that's all you needed to make your assumptions. Her words struck a chord with everyone around her. The crowd stood in stunned silence, taking in the weight of her accusation. Henderson opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. There was nothing he could say to erase the harm he had caused. As Henderson stood there, speechless and defeated, Sophie stepped forward. She had been quietly holding her phone throughout the entire exchange, and now she raised it, showing the screen to the crowd. I've been recording this entire incident, she said, her voice steady and clear. The phone screen revealed everything: the deputy's initial confrontation, his aggression, the invasive search of Mrs. Clarice's car, and his continuous disrespect. The recording was undeniable evidence of the deputy's actions, capturing each moment with stark clarity. Henderson's face turned even paler as the realization sank in. The evidence was right in front of him, and there was no denying the truth. His actions had been caught on camera, and the tide had completely turned against him. Sophie's recording had sealed his fate, exposing the deputy's racism for all to see. Michael Donovan, seeing the recording and understanding its impact, addressed the crowd. This deputy's behavior will not go unaddressed. I will personally ensure an investigation into his actions and that justice is served. The weight of that promise hung in the air, a powerful symbol of accountability. For the first time in this entire confrontation, Deputy Henderson realized that his authority was no longer unquestioned. The community had spoken, and the truth was out. Eleanor stood strong, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced injustice, and now, with the full force of the community behind her, the fight for justice was far from over. It had only just begun. As the weight of Deputy Henderson's actions began to sink in, the energy in the crowd shifted. What had started as a small group of hesitant onlookers was now a united front, a community standing in solidarity with Mrs. Clarice. The revelation of her true identity as a newly appointed judge had been a shock, but it was the deputy's racist behavior exposed for all to see that was the real catalyst for change. The silence that had defined their earlier reactions was now replaced by voices demanding justice, voices calling for change. The crowd, which had once stood in uneasy quiet, now spoke with conviction. The people who had watched the events unfold in front of them, too afraid to speak out just moments ago, were now expressing their anger, their disbelief, and their determination. Some called for immediate action against Deputy Henderson. Others shared stories of their own experiences with racial prejudice and systemic injustice. But there was one thing that united them all: the understanding that what had happened to Mrs. Clarice was not just an isolated incident. It was a reflection of a much larger issue, one that affected their entire community. The transformation of the crowd's energy didn't go unnoticed. Mrs. Clarice stood there watching the shift with quiet pride. Her heart swelled with a mixture of gratitude and hope. She had long known that change didn't come easily. It was a process, a battle, fought one step at a time. But now, in this moment, She could see it happening. The community was awakening to the reality of racial injustice and the importance of standing up when that injustice was right in front of them. With calm authority, Mrs. Clarice raised her hand, signaling for the crowd to quiet down. The murmurs slowly faded, and all eyes turned to her. She had the kind of presence that commanded respect without ever demanding it. She had spent a lifetime fighting for equality, for the rights of those who had been marginalized, and now with a steady voice, she spoke to the very people who had come to her side in the face of adversity. I stand before you today not just as a victim of prejudice, but as a witness to the power of collective action, Mrs. Clarice began, her voice carrying across the crowd. What we witness today, what happened to me, is not an isolated event. It is a symptom of a much larger problem that runs deep in our society. It is a problem that has existed for generations and will continue unless we choose to confront it, unless we choose to act. Her words resonated with the crowd, and the truth of her message struck a chord. Mrs. Clarice paused, allowing her words to settle before continuing. The system that we rely on to protect us has been built on foundations of inequality. Too often those in power, whether they wear badges or hold office, have acted with impunity, knowing that their actions will go unchecked. We cannot continue to live in a world where our brothers and sisters are treated as less than simply because of the color of their skin, their background, or where they come from. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sophie, who had been filming the incident earlier, felt a surge of emotion rise within her as she listened. She had seen this injustice firsthand, and now more than ever she understood that her role was not just to document, but to stand alongside the people who were pushing for real change. Mrs. Clarice's voice grew stronger, more impassioned. We need systemic change. We need accountability for those who abuse their power. And it starts with us, right here, right now. We cannot afford to be silent any longer. The time for change is now. The crowd erupted into applause, the energy growing. But Mrs. Clarice held up her hand again, signaling for them to listen. We have a long road ahead of us, she continued, but we will not walk it alone. We will build a community that is stronger, more united, and more just. We will educate ourselves, our children, and our neighbors about the importance of equity and justice, and we will hold those in power accountable. She turned to Michael Donovan, who had been standing quietly by her side, watching the transformation of the crowd. He nodded in agreement, and it was clear that he too understood the gravity of the moment. Michael, Mrs. Clarice said, her tone steady, I propose that we start a program, a community initiative to reform our local police and create educational programs that teach equity, justice, and the importance of standing up against injustice. We need to ensure that future generations grow up in a world where they are not only aware of the injustices around them, but are equipped with the tools to fight for change. Michael Donovan stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of his position. I fully support Mrs. Clarice's initiative. We will work together to implement a program that brings our community closer and ensures that these issues are addressed in meaningful ways. We cannot afford to wait any longer. I will take immediate steps to begin this process. The crowd responded with renewed enthusiasm, many already discussing how they could contribute to the cause. Laura Bennett, the pharmacist who had spoken out in Eleanor's defense earlier, stepped forward with a determined look in her eyes. I'll volunteer. I'll help with the community education efforts, she said, her voice resolute. I've seen what happens when people stay silent, and I won't be silent anymore. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure this doesn't happen again. Sophie, who had recorded the entire incident, nodded in agreement. I'll help too. I have a platform, and I'll use it to spread the word, to make sure people hear about what happened here today and what we're doing to change things. James Caldwell, who had been the first to speak up against Henderson's actions, joined in. I'll be part of this, too. We've all seen the harm that can come from not standing up, from turning a blind eye. But today we've proven that we have the power to change things. Let's keep this momentum going. The crowd erupted into applause once more, and as Mrs. Clarice looked out over the sea of faces, she knew that the seeds of change had been planted. The struggle for justice would not be easy, but it was a fight worth taking on. Together they would challenge the status quo, demanding accountability, and paving the way for a future where equity and fairness would no longer be dreams, but a reality. For the first time in a long while, Mrs. Clarice felt a sense of hope, knowing that the community, once divided by fear and silence, was now united in its commitment to change. And as they all stood there side by side, she knew that the power of collective action had already begun to reshape their world. As the days passed, the momentum for change continued to build. The community, once silent in the face of injustice, had found its voice, and now that voice would echo in a powerful, lasting tribute. A mural was painted in the heart of the community center, a vibrant, bold masterpiece that depicted Mrs. Clarice Brooks standing tall, her posture unwavering with the words, "Justice begins with courage," written beneath her. The mural was more than just an image. It was a symbol of what had been achieved and what was still to come. It was a testament to the power of one person, the ripple effect of one act of courage, and the unyielding strength of a community, united in the fight for justice. For Mrs. Clarice, seeing the mural was an emotional moment. It wasn't just about her. It was about the collective strength of everyone who had stood by her side, from the silent onlookers to those who had found their voices and the courage to act. It was a reflection of what they had built together, a community that no longer turned away, but now stood firm in the face of injustice. The mural was a reminder to every passerby that justice was not a passive ideal, but an active pursuit, one that required bravery, resilience, and unity. As Eleanor stood before the mural, her heart swelled with pride and gratitude. She had spent a lifetime fighting for equality, and though the journey was far from over, this moment felt like a turning point. The power of collective action was undeniable, and she knew that this community, no longer complacent, would continue to push for change. The fight for justice was not one she could face alone, but together they were unstoppable. The final message of her story was clear. Find the courage to stand up against injustice. No matter how difficult the road may seem, no matter the obstacles, courage is the spark that ignites change. To each person reading this, Mrs. Clarice would say, "Your voice matters, your actions matter. Don't be silent. Don't turn away. Because justice, true justice, begins with courage." And with those, the call to action was set forth, an invitation for everyone to be part of something larger, something transformative, because together they could reshape the future.